For the first time in human history, carbon dioxide parts per million has crossed the 400 mark. Join me today on Roundtable Perspective with Dr. Katherine Moore Powell to discuss how that climate change affects the dunes and northwest Indiana, how the parts per million will affect the Karner blue butterfly, and the condition of what we do on weekends. Hello, welcome to Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Katherine Moore Powell. We're going to discuss climate change. Always a hot topic. Dr. Powell is the climate ecologist at the Field Museum. She got her Ph.D. from the University of Colorado in environmental studies, and I understand your immediate task is to find an adaptation program for the dunes.
Yep.
I'd like to start with something you probably hear all the time, and as an ecologist, it probably defines much of your day, but how would you tell somebody what climate change is and why we should be concerned about it?
Oh, well, there's a lot of different ways you can go about explaining this. And
we only have 25 minutes. Yes.
And one of the hardest parts is not sounding like all the other talking heads from the scientific community that are explaining climate change, but we know that for some time now, for the industrial age, we have been releasing gases into the atmosphere, CO2 being the most popular one, but greenhouse gases that are causing the atmosphere to radiate a lot of heat back towards or to contain it.
Okay, that's because there's carbon dioxide in the air, and why would that make it warmer?
Well, and let's make sure that we're talking about all greenhouse gases. Okay. So any of them are really necessary. They trap the sun's rays, and this greenhouse effect of trapping the rays is important for keeping the Earth's temperature, especially at the surface of the Earth.
So greenhouse gas is a good thing.
It is a good thing.
Up until a point.
We've always had it.
Yes.
I mean, nearly as long as the Earth's existed, and up to a point, exactly. Yeah. And there's obviously cycles, besides seasonal cycles, there are cycles, long-term cycles, geologic cycles to the Earth. But in general, for life to exist on this planet, you have to have some of this greenhouse trapping heat in order to maintain a range of temperature which is hospitable for living things.
So what happens when we get the carbon dioxide? I just read it, I'm not an ecologist, but I read that it broke the 400 parts per million with carbon dioxide, and
I think the most important part isn't just how much there is or that there's more of it, it's how fast it's happening. And I think that's the key here. Because we're burning things that are considered fossils. They absorbed the Earth's energy millions and millions of years ago.
And that's where
and we're burning it really quickly.
So you're letting it out quickly. Okay.
And we're adding to the concentration at a really rapid rate.
Which
and we're
means
also changing this heat dynamic within the Earth at a very fast rate.
Okay.
So the important thing that I would say, especially as an ecologist, is that humans, natural systems, organisms, really have the capacity to adapt. We know this. The problem is the rate of change
so
is
fast,
really
there's no adaptation.
Well, some, but we're going to lose a lot of things in the process.
Again, I read I'm not an ecologist, but I read that the photosynthesis of the cells is changing their basic biological patterns, and I'm not sure what that will mean. But I don't want to keep this because we don't have time, but I'm struggling to see what happens. What causes the Earth to warm up when there are more parts of whatever it is?
Oh, okay.
What's that?
So some of the physics.
Quickly, because I want to get to the things.
Many of these greenhouse gases, if you could see the molecular level, and one of my favorite when we were teaching undergrads, especially without a science background, how to visualize this, is just picture them moving faster. The molecules have a way of allowing the energy that's coming in from the sun goes right through it, doesn't really
Right,
activate it.
right.
But as it's coming back off the Earth, it's a different
Oh,
wavelength.
it gets blocked.
It doesn't block it so much as it absorbs that energy and re-radiates it back down.
We think of Indiana, Illinois, the whole Midwest as deindustrialized, right? Part of the globalization is we don't make things anymore, so all of that pollution that went out, that stopped. So apparently we shouldn't have this problem. But again, I read, maybe I should stop reading, but I read that the Midwest puts out 20% more on average of greenhouse gases than the rest of the country. And so what's the effect of that? You're working on the dunes, and it's got to affect plants and animals. So
When we are talking about the emissions in general, and whether you're talking about affecting greenhouse gases on the long term or pollutants that directly impact the areas, you have a suite of responses from the natural world. And so what this means is that in some cases, when you're driving your cars through an area, we are actually emitting things that add to the nitrogen content in the air, which adds nitrogen fertilization to natural areas. And I don't know if you've ever done any gardening, we add fertilizers, and one of the biggest components in fertilizers is nitrogen. This might sound like a good thing, but adding nitrogen in this manner actually can do more damage. It can cause things to bloom that shouldn't be blooming at times when they shouldn't be blooming, and maybe far too fast or too much. So one of the most impressive examples of this is when you look at the Great Lakes and you see things like algal blooms, which when you have an algal bloom, and you can have this in many ecosystems, it's too much of a good thing in that it's too fast, it takes up a lot of the nutrients, space, light, etc., and it crowds everything else out. And so in the wake of these blooms, or in the case of an ecosystem that's had nitrogen fertilization, when you have too much growth of one sort of organism, it crowds out all the other things. And an ecosystem is a really delicate balance between many organisms.
when you say delegate, I think of butterflies.
And yes, and so when we're talking about the dunes, one of the most emblematic of the effects that you'll see in an ecosystem being out of balance are the loss of certain organisms. One of them in Indiana dunes has been the Karner blue butterfly. This is an adorable, cute little butterfly, blue of course, and it's a pollinator, so it's very important to an ecosystem. Its main habitat is savanna, oak savanna. Now, oak savannas are already in decline,
Yes.
especially throughout the Midwest, but in particular in Indiana and Illinois. Our efforts to improve the habitats for the butterfly actually improve habitats for many organisms. But it's kind of a sign that this particular habitat is already having trouble.
So where is I mean, you're talking about the Karner blue butterfly. What's the status now?
It's considered extirpated or winked out. What's happened
mean
is
extinct?
It doesn't exactly mean extinct in the way that you think of it. It means it's extinct in a particular area.
Okay, so it's gone from the dunes.
It's gone from the dunes, and it was declining. It was having trouble already from many different forces, mostly from that legacy of industrialization and from fragmenting its habitat, and from the loss of some of the savannas, but also because of climate change. So when you have something very vulnerable that's already struggling, what can happen many times is climate change comes in and deals it a kind of a death blow. And that's what happened in 2012. We had a year where the life cycle of that particular butterfly is linked to the wild lupin. It's just one species of flower. It's a beautiful flower. And it was doing better. However, it being there wasn't enough. The two have to be synced up. This is why ecosystems
If the
are so
flower
delicate.
depends on the lupin and the lupin's not there, I mean, when the butterfly's
Right.
not there, at the same time
and
the
the other way
lupin is, I
around.
show up for dinner and nobody put it on the table.
Exactly.
I'm gonna go hungry.
So we've been having earlier and earlier springs, and
Yes.
that can cause a lot of organisms to go out of sync with each other if a particular flower is blooming too early for the insects that are used to pollinating it or breeding with it. So if it blooms too early and it's finished its life cycle,
There's nothing there.
right?
Yeah.
And so it actually had a double whammy that year in that summer we actually had a protracted drought, and so the second try for the already failing blue butterfly, the Karner blue, got completely that particular life cycle, breeding cycle, got cut off very short by a drought.
I'm just thinking we need a television show to popularize these problems with climate change. You watch the Game of Thrones and they say winter is coming, right?
Yeah.
Spring is coming, summer is coming, and the Karner blue butterfly is going. So
Yes.
we probably need a different approach to this whole thing. So, but you recently wrote Gases, Eddies, and Why Climate Change is Messing Up Your Jet Set Life.
Yeah.
Yes? And where would we find that?
Now that's a blog post that I'm writing for the Field Museum.
Okay, so it's a Field Museum blog post.
Yes,
okay.
it is. And it's the beginning of a series. And what I decided to do, this was in relation to the summer heat and how it is that jets couldn't take off. And
It was so hot the jets couldn't fly.
so hot the jets couldn't fly. And part of the reason I did that is, first of all, I have a pilot's license, so I know how aerodynamics work.
So you're
especially.
a contributor to global warming.
Okay, yes, well, we all are. Every time I breathe, I am.
Yes.
But I decided this was a great opportunity in a fun way to talk about some basic science concepts. And so I started with that one in order to talk about fluid dynamics, and in particular, so that people could understand. And I write in the blog post from the perspective of a pilot.
Oh, good. Okay.
So that you can kind of understand that air is a fluid.
I think
and-
that's irreplaceable
yeah.
for people to be able to understand what's being discussed when you talk about climate change. And it's
Sure.
not scientists just arguing with each other or arguing with a congressperson, but it's actually,
Sure.
so that blog post, and how would you find that? That's you would go to the Field Museum, and then within there you're going to work your
Right.
way to your
Yes.
Dr. Katherine Moore Powell's
And now
blog
here's
post.
the thing, they're working on the website, but it's going to take some
Okay.
time in redoing it. However, you should be able to
Okay.
look up my name
Okay.
and find it very easily.
So we're going to talk about fluids.
Yes.
One of the things they say about environmentalists is they're all tree huggers. But if you're dealing with fluid, you're not going to drink it. I mean, you might drink it, you're not going to hug it, right? So you're a water drinker. But you're working on an adaptation action plan. Would you talk a little bit about what that is for the
Yeah.
dunes, right? It's
Yes,
for the dunes, yes.
for the
Okay.
Indiana dunes. And an adaptation plan is a way, and these are being done in cities and national parks, et cetera. This is a way for a place to adapt to the changes that climate is bringing to it. Mitigation would be reducing emissions, et cetera. But the other half of this equation is, figuring out what's going to happen and how do we deal with it. If the most obvious example is if you lived in Miami, you know sea level rise is coming, you can do some things to prepare for that. So in the dunes, what we've done is we've actually, working with the national park, working with the state of Indiana, they have a state park embedded in there, working through Save the Dunes, a nonprofit, and several other partners in the area. We brought together people to discuss what are the stressors that we expect to happen from climate change, what do those then translate into as far as what kind of changes do we expect to see,
Okay.
and then finally what do we do about it. And we worked through a very long process with land managers and with scientists, and interestingly with Purdue, actually, because they were at the same time developing a downscaled model. This is where you take those global models and you take the information and you do some pretty high statistical and dynamic modeling, but they did it specifically just for the state of Indiana in order to give the state a much higher resolution of changes.
So you're saying if the parts per million of greenhouse gases and there's water pollution and there will be this adaptation, so rather than arguing if this is or isn't going to happen, you kind of go on the assumption that it is,
Yep.
and then you want to see what is the outcome going to be, and then you try to adapt to that projected outcome.
Correct, correct.
So what are you doing?
So, so we met, we went through all of those, we used Purdue's hot off the presses projections for Northwest Indiana. We are prioritizing, they've already prioritized what they would like to do within these parks. But one of the things that came out of it, the most exciting thing that came out of it, was watching land managers discuss how they need to rethink land management itself and the use of some of the tools going forward. So this is a really positive thing because it's a recognition not only that they're in the best position to make some judgments, but they're open to listening to the science coming in. And they're also thinking this, this rate of change I talked about, it's happening so fast in the area that they've got to start getting novel in their approaches and start
Is it evident
using
to
new
people
things.
that the rate of change is happening rapidly in the area? I mean, one thing you can see hurricanes, and they repeat,
Sure,
and you can
yeah.
see fires. Well, what are the indicators in the dunes or in Northwest Indiana that this rate of change is happening such that land managers would notice this or accept it as opposed to just a political statement? What are some of the things that are happening that,
If you
besides
talk
the
to,
blue butterfly?
You could talk to farmers or land managers and you get nearly the same thing.
Okay.
They see species moving into the area that they've never seen before. This last year we had probably one of the highest number of deer tick and lots of ticks. The increase in Lyme disease is continuing to go up. And then, all you have to do is drive along the interstates around here and you see Phragmites. It's that tall reed that you see in a lot of the culverts and the roadways, very tall, it's got a little puffy top to it. This is an invasive grass that has been really taking over a lot of natural areas, and they see this. And anybody who, and believe me, I'm talking to people who've been doing work in this area for 30 years or more, they can see. They see the change in temperatures and the loss of some of the freezing and some of the lake effect snow. Now, the other thing that we're seeing with climate change, in particular coming to this area, is it's not as,
It's not as dramatic as a hurricane
not like
or
the
a fire.
hurricanes.
Yes,
it's
yes.
probably not going to make those kind of headlines, but the variability is what is really hitting this area. So you'll have a year still where you'll have an incredible lake effect snow and it'll be very cold.
And there goes climate change.
And
So you
people
can't-
think climate
yes,
change,
yes.
and that's exactly,
What
it is a
happens?
sign of climate change because that's what we're expecting to see, and then the very next year you have it super hot, almost no snow, et cetera.
So this must be very stressful on, well, I guess plants and animals, but it would seem like plants in particular because they can't move.
Right.
They're here. So
Well,
is that
do move. That's the thing. They spread seeds. They employ birds and other pollinators and animals to move
But I mean,
them.
like if a plant
Right.
expects a certain temperature and it grows best at that temperature, and the temperature suddenly changes, it's hard to move
It is.
north 150 miles to
It is.
northern Michigan, not being here.
And that's where we're back to the rate thing again.
Yes.
Obviously, plants can migrate over time.
If there's enough time,
But there's
they could,
enough,
they could
right.
adapt. But without
You
that,
know, you have another thing too. With Lake Michigan right there, you've got kind of this barrier, this natural huge body of water that's a barrier to
You're not going
some
north.
of them. Right. Right. And you could go north, but you're going to run into
Yeah.
Chicago, which is another reason why it's important for cities.
well, the dunes is
and
in a
large
very
areas.
unique place. I
It
mean,
is.
it's really compacted, and what it
It
represents is very, I think, unique biologically in other ways. So-
Absolutely, absolutely.
So
and
what
and
is-
the people in the area have valued it for a long time, whether they believe climate change is happening or not. And I have not run into people who have pushed against this at all.
Well, that's good.
Yeah, it has
And
been
the-
really, really good working with people in Northwest Indiana.
So more on the plan. So what's the adaptation? You said land managers are talking about how they should manage this, and you're involved as from the Field
Yeah.
Museum. So just a couple of highlights of what.
So
what
a couple
might be some
highlights,
of-
because we're still actually putting the final touches on the plan. So I don't want to.
You
talk
heard it here
too
first. Okay. Yes.
But we did talk a lot about controlled burns. And I wanted to talk about this in relation to land management and climate change anyway, because a controlled burn using fire as a management tool has been very important for land managers, and in particular for preserving prairies and savannas. Part of the reason is because these areas, these habitats expect fire on a regular basis. It's how they
They've adapted to
maintain.
that. Yes,
Oh,
okay.
absolutely.
Yes, okay.
And grasses in particular, their growth, the part of the plant that grows is below ground, so fire doesn't kill it. What it does is it removes
Makes
things.
space so it
yeah.
can grow.
And that space is really important for a lot of organisms because it allows light in. But the way that we manage means that we have to be very careful using fire. You're close to built environments. You have to worry about where the smoke goes. There are state and federal regulations about when you can do your burn. So some of the changes that are happening are how controlled burns, how fire is used as a management tool. We're discussing different ways to change it. The simplest would be things like expanding the windows for allowing land managers to burn, because obviously we're having earlier and earlier springs.
And that might deal with some of the invasive species as well. Yes.
Absolutely, yes. To talk to a few of the land managers, they felt that for Phragmites, a slash and burn is almost the only effective thing they've seen. But in addition to that, you are looking at a way of, and the dunes is really interesting for doing this. It is where the theory of succession was developed, because what you have from Lake Michigan moving back are these beautiful dune and swale environments, and you can almost watch how land evolves over time, but in a very short distance. This is kind of an interesting place to start thinking about, well, perhaps maybe we don't manage for the same sort of habitats we used to. And we begin to rethink what we were doing before. This might mean accepting that some things will go extinct, like the Karner blue, in a particular area, that putting the time and energy towards helping it might be better spent towards something else.
Yes. Well, that's kind of where I'd like to end.
Okay.
And I kind of started with the question of does climate change exist? I'd like to end because part of me is thinking about when you start on the assumption that this is what's going to happen, so we have to adapt to it, is a political statement that says there's nothing that we can do to change the policies that we currently live under. So we can't save the blue butterfly, we can't save the brown squirrel, we can't save the green grass. What are we going to do? So we'll just kind of we'll get used to the fact that we're going to have polluted air, polluted water, and then there will be some technical fix to it. And that's as frightening to me as the actual outcome, as the political response to the human response to the political realities of the two-party electoral system that distorts the science, that distorts whether I got a deer tick on me. So, I mean, and I know you're an ecologist, so it's not that. But I just wonder, how do you answer that when somebody says, well, we shouldn't give up on changing the way things are developing, even as we are anticipating some things might be bad? Is that a fair statement? Question?
They're all fair. And one of the things that I would say is that we have to remember that humans are part of ecology. We are a part of the natural world. And these technical solutions aren't always bad. Sometimes they're necessary, but they also rely on the natural world functioning in a certain way. So first I would say, and as a scientist, whether you're an ecologist or any other kind of scientist, that having skeptics or having people question things is okay. It's a very healthy sign. And so I think the most important part was this should be an exchange of ideas. So if you were sitting down and discussing options with a surgeon who just diagnosed you with cancer, I'm certain they've dealt with people who don't want to believe that either, but it would be far more productive to simply get the information you need and certainly question things. You would like that diagnosis to be wrong, but you have to understand that you're talking to people with expertise that spend all day doing nothing but studying the very thing that you're questioning. They must know something. So one of the other things that I would say about that is that we are already feeling the effects. There are many people around the world that have felt these effects for some time and in much stronger terms than we have.
It's almost like it's a battle between the rapid rate at which climate is changing and the rapid rate that humans begin to understand that it's changing and then take some action to resolve it. So
and to be clear, humans are already taking a lot of action in many places.
Yes, including the Field Museum and the Adaptation Action Plan. And at the start I said this time goes quickly. And I'm sure we could talk more to get into many of these things. But Dr. Katherine Moore Powell, I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
And maybe we can do this again.
Okay.
That's all the time we have on our program. Thank you for joining me today on Roundtable Perspective. I'm Lee Artz, and we will see you next time.